Good morning, traders, and a very happy Friday out there to everyone. Hope that y'all had a nice evening there, and hey, an early happy Veterans Day out there. I think we have that on Saturday there, so happy Veterans Day to all those who have served out there. And with that said, without further ado, here we have a pretty nice and light calendar here for today's purposes. All we have is that 10 o'clock figure, which will be our consumer sentiment and inflation expectations, both of which will be at the top of those first 30 minutes going into that 10 o'clock Eastern time of day window. So of those two take into account. But outside of that, pretty nice and light on the board there. It's just a normal Friday, no major option expiration cycle expiration either, so that's perfectly fine. And what we'll do here is come over here and have our daily chart on these S&Ps. We know that yesterday we had our high to low bar, our upside down bar with the first close below the 5 SMA after having some nice consecutive closes up above it. We did have our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then yesterday we had our first close beneath it there. So what we did at least see on these daily bars is that we were able to get follow through, or at least traded beneath the previous day's low in the overnight session. That was our 43.57.75. So we did trade on the other side of it there, and we'll look at the intraday charts in a moment because we can also note that we did some partial testing into the gap area in the U.S. session, and then we made the lower low in the overnight. But now we're working ourselves back up, and what we'll want to consider here, at least on the dailies, is that 43.82 will be the 5 SMA there. So that'll be of good interest for us, as far as intraday, as well as seeing, where we go to close on the day, because yesterday was our first close back beneath that. So, 43.82 should serve us fairly well in the session there today. What would be more of a cause for concern, or what would you know, change that line of thinking, if you would be as if we came back and dropped below that overnight low of 43.54 and a quarter. So for now, giving them the benefit of the doubt, they're, maintaining, holding their ground. They already traded below the previous day's low, so we'll put a nice yellow line in there in case, we had any type of adverse movement and started to work below that overnight low, because then we would have the gap area to still consider. But for now, we're doing a fairly good job of maintaining our ground. So that's where we stand on just the daily configuration. Granted, also, we know that we're kind of rotating back inside of this previous congestion zone still, so nothing wrong with that. And then as we come down to the intraday data, we'll blow up this 120-minute chart and include enough data points, giving us that same feeling that we're still inside of that previous broader range. And as we blow this up in a little more detail, we'll come down to like an hourly chart. So we came down, right? This was our close yesterday, shortly after those two large impulse bars on the hourly. So it was shortly after we settled that reopening there, we did proceed to make a lower low. So that's fine. That was that 54 and a quarter. And then what we saw is a little counter-reactive lift during that Asia session, right? So Asia brought it back up, and then Europe proceeded to test back down, but we did not make a full retest down. So early morning, just on the hourly chart, we're giving a little bit of the U-turn feeling. So what we're doing is, walking back, trading back inside of some of the damage that was done from our previous selling pressure there that was done during yesterday's trading. So for now, they're, working themselves back up with a little counter-reactive movement. It's going to be that same feeling, the yellow line there, just because if I come over here to the pit session only display, we can note that we just tested barely into that first initial gap area. 43.58 and a quarter was the low from November 3rd there in the pit session. And then during yesterday's trading, we traded down to 43.57.75. So we traded 2 ticks inside of the gap area there basis these E-minis. So that was perfectly okay. They didn't do a complete fill or anything like that. They just kind of tested in there, and that's essentially where we settled. And then overnight, like we said, we came down, made a slightly lower low, and then in that Europe session, then we proceeded to hold up a little better. So With that said, this blue line here is also going to line up with that 5 SMA on the daily chart, that 43.83, 43.84 general area there. So we'll see how that serves us on both the dailies as well as the intraday charts, but not too bad as far as the ES goes. And then we have our DAX future here. DAX had a pretty good showcasing of strength yesterday, but it did have a little more defined 2 days of low to high. So we did leave a bit of a tail yesterday on the DAX. We closed off of the highs, and now we're trading inside of yesterday's range. Different configuration slightly than that of our ES because we didn't quite have that close below like we did in the E-minis. We had a very close test. We tested beneath it but proceeded to close above it still. So the DAX still has yet to have its close back beneath that 5 SMA. In today's case here, we have 15,273 as where that 5 SMA comes in there for that DAX. However, when we come over to the intraday display, we have an hourly chart here on this top left-hand side. If I were to blow up our hourlies, just come in here. Two well-defined data points down here. 15,133. Of course, that's a ways down there, so we're holding above that. And then I'm viewing the stacks here on the hourly chart, just from coming off of their high in a bit of an ABC or more of a complex correction, right? So a two-part wave and movement down, a little bit of a check back, right? A lower high came right back up to what was our PD high at the time, this 15,354. So we came back up, did some testing there, just did not quite proceed to maintain, and then we had the next test down. So we have our nice A, B, C type of rhythm on the hourly chart, and essentially digesting some of the progress that it's made over the past two trading days, right after those 2 days of low to high. So giving the DAX plenty of room to roam, inside of the past 2 days trading there. Not expecting them to have too much damage done or anything like that because the S&Ps are still maintaining and they're holding their ground. But what we'll leave up here is this hourly chart just in case they do start to pick up some additional traction. We'll have our points of interest laid out ahead of time. So that's where we stand on this nice DAX, the daily as well as the hourly time frames. Not to have bad. Then we have that of the euro currency here. Right, this is going to be a pretty crucial one here for it, today because it has still been trying to maintain a good bulk of that Friday impulse bar that we had to the upside. So we've been leaving some tails. We know yesterday we came down, gave it a pretty close test there on the previous day's low during yesterday's trading. Overnight we did slip down and make a slightly lower low on this daily bar. So they did get some follow through from yesterday's high to low, but still no trade on the other side of this nice impulse bar from last week on Friday, which we'll see in further detail on our hourly data. Same idea, 1.06660 was the bottom of that zone. So we've been coming awfully close. We've been having these several tests with slightly lower cycle lows here on the euro currency. So this was just the original takeoff point here, so I've been viewing that as a point of interest, but we've been coming down slightly lower, but haven't really come down to fully retrace that. So EC still trying to muster up some holding there. However, this would be, pretty important zone there. I wouldn't want to see them, come down and slip beneath that. And then as we can see on the hourlies, obviously, we know we had some selling pressure during yesterday, especially after the auction results there from the 30 years. So we have this big impulse bar where we also had, sharp up or quick movement to the upside, sideways action, and then we had quick movement down throughout that area. So in other words, we haven't spent a whole lot of time really developing much area there in that of the euro currency. So we'll keep that in mind. Then we have our caution zone down below. I'm just simply kind of referencing these areas, quick up through that area, sideways. We did come down, fill it out a little bit, but then we had sharp down through it again. So this area hasn't been traded through a whole lot there in that euro currency. So we'll keep an eye though. So far, a slightly lower low in the overnight session, but still trading inside of yesterday's range. That's where we stand on that of the EC. And then we got the old gold. For this gold, we really need to be out on a nice 240-minute display. And here with this gold, what we're coming back a little closer towards here is going to be this 1946. Alright, so we'll do as we did before. We start things off here with the view on the dailies. Alright, so we had our pause bar of green during yesterday's trading after having 3 days of nice high to low previous cycle high from the very large range expansion bar that we had to the upside. That was that October 13th bar. The tippy top of that is at 1946.2. So just from being a previous cycle high. So as we come down to the gold, we have traded on the other side of the previous day's low. That's that 1948.3. So we were making a lower low. And then as we come over here to something like the 240-minute display, include just a notch more data points. So here's the same 1946. Of course, the yellow line we've already breached, so we're already on the other side of that. We had our little reversion to the 240-minute EMA early on in the session yesterday. So as we come back down, we have that as being a nice reference point, 1946. And not sure we'll be, making too much of a major movement, but then we have an additional cycle low beneath that 1946. However, that's at 1933, just referencing these, 240-minute pieces of data, the intraday chart. So nice previous cycle high at the 46.2. If we don't proceed to hold in there at all, down beneath that we have a little congestion in 1933 would be that previous cycle low. So that's where we stand on the gold. And then in all fairness, what would change that line of thinking? If the gold started to showcase some footing and then came back above 1962.8, that would give us a little better, or a little bit of a different feeling. But for now, working themselves down, just trading a little on the other side of that previous day's low as far as the gold goes. But some, pretty decent rhythm going on there. So we'll definitely want to keep a watch on that. That of the GC. And next up in the queue, we have the crude. The crude rather interesting because yesterday was one of the few that actually had an inside range bar. So the crude had been working with, nice movement. We had the movement outside of the inside range bar from before, right? Big range expansion bar down out of the little breakout mode. Got good follow through, and then yesterday we also formed ourselves a inside range bar. So no trade below that 2-day low, which comes in at 74.91 in the case of our crude. Right, so we held up a little bit of a higher low, but on the same token, from the heavy selling pressure that we had, need to mark off the top of our little follow through bar at 77.53. So I know it's a bit of a wide region there for the crude, but between the 74.91, which of course is the low, which we're doing a fairly good job of holding ourselves up above, but on the same token, that 77.51, if we just look at this 120-minute chart, blow it up here a notch, and just note the fact that, getting on the other side of that, we had all this selling pressure from that original impulse bar that we would still have to deal with. So might have a little work cut out for itself there in the crude, but still nice rhythm coming up off its lows. We had a little 120-minute divergence, but that was unfolding during yesterday's trading. So we came out, reverted to the mean, and then started to make a little bit of a higher low. Mind you, this is kind of interesting as well, comparing up against the gold, right? Because the gold as well had similar feelings of, buy divergence, reversion to the mean. But the gold in this case here has been making a lower low, whereas that crude on the 120-minute display held up a little better and put in a slightly higher low. So that's a little comparison there between that crude and the gold. That's rather an interesting observation. So we have that going on. And then lastly here, before we jump into the bonds, did want to check back up here on the CD, because we mentioned, or we were looking at that one on the radar during yesterday's trading. So just to include a little something different for our morning overview, just including another group, since we also don't have any 8:30 data points or anything there. We're nice and light on the calendar, and a little pre-Veterans Day action there. But with something like the CD, for interest here, we did proceed to come down. Yesterday was rather interesting. We had our, couple consecutive, down red bars. Yesterday we left the tail up above and then traded below the previous day's low. So we had ourselves an outside range bar. And as we're coming down here, we're certainly reaching a little closer towards this, inside pocket on the daily chart. Over on our 120-minute or intraday display, we definitely did not quite get up to the 72,355, which were previous cycle lows. We had our little spike tail, right? Came very close to trading on the other side of the 5 SMA, but couldn't quite fully get there. So what what we can come in here and do is mark off our pertinent points here. For one, 72,440, very nice and visible. Two, well-defined, data points. And then any further down, I would be looking at this impulse bar that we originally had to the upside, helping us with some of this movement that we had. So between 72,440, 72,330, looking at those as being, perhaps initial supportive regions, lining up with the inside pocket there as far as the CD goes, the CAD, the Canadian dollar. So see how that one shapes up. Obviously, quite a lot different than that of the euro currency, holding its ground in a more of a defined feeling, with that Friday range expansion bar. So we'll see how the currencies shape up today. It should be a rather important weekly closing bar for them. And then last but certainly not least, because they had quite the action there yesterday, is that of our fixed income, the bonds. Bonds giving their range expansion bar high to low during yesterday's trading. Almost, not quite as extreme, but almost reminds us to some extent of what we had in the E-minis, right? Because we had in the bonds our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not quite that 7 closes above like we had in the E-minis, but we did get, long liquidation flush or, range expansion bar down. No trade, though, below that previous day's low, which we'll look at in a moment. The 112.12 super reference level there. So we'll leave that as a yellow point. If we come back beneath that point, that'll be a whole different story. But we're doing a real nice job of proceeding to maintain ourselves above the previous day's low. We're trading a little on the other side of the 5 SMA. And what we also might consider is that due to the nature of yesterday's very large range expansion bar, sometimes nice to note where the middle point, the 50% retracement point, would come in on a day like that. So for the bonds, high to low, 115.12 being the previous day's high, and 112.12 is being the previous day's low. A perfect three-handle, range on the bonds. So what that leaves us with is 113.28 as being in the middle of the previous day's range there in the bond. So we did give that a bit of a test, it looks like. Yeah, so we retraced a little more than 50% in this overnight session. So we'll see how we want to trade at and around that point. Also, I'd have to say it comes in pretty darn close with that 5 SMA as well. But that's where we stand on the dailies. That's kind of like our little departure point. Sorry about that. Was going to grab our intraday bond and snuck in a little S&P chart there. But with that said, let me scoot this over here. So with the bonds, of course, that's going to give us that same feeling, right? They came down and did not make a lower low, kind of like the S&P still. So they're, working on a mild, kind of U-turn feeling. However, with the bonds, remember, on the way up, we had the 114.12, and then we had the tail from Friday, that 114.27. So on this intraday chart, the hourlies, right, there's our 112.12, several tests, so that's got a nice yellow line there for us. And we came down, failed to make that full retest. So as we come back up, we'll have the 114.10 to still deal with, so that might be a hurdle for them. But outside of that, we also mentioned, right, they're coming up and trading just a little bit around the middle of yesterday's range in the case of these 30 years. Then for fun, we could come in, look at the notes, the 10 years also. Fairly similar, right? They did not make a lower low in the overnight session either. They had some damage that was done. 107.29 is where their 5 SMA comes into sight, but similar with respect to how they came down in the overnight. Held up, a little bit of a higher low on the hourly charts. The dailies, though, just like the ES once again here, we closed and then we made a lower low pretty quickly on in the overnight session. So it's more of like, you could say, Asia made the lower low, right? Because it was after the reopening. And then the Europe session was the one that was putting in more of that higher low feeling. So looking at the daily charts here, still referring to the 10-year notes, range expansion bar down, follow through, traded below the previous day's low. But on the hourly charts, it shows up as a nice, higher low because we made that lower low in the early Asia session. So just a little, thing to consider there on these tens, and like we said, kind of similar there in the ES, right? Because if we take this daily bar here in the S&Ps, and we blow up this hourly chart, right? We made the little lower low on this daily bar, right? We traded beneath the previous day's low, but over here on the hourly charts, just looks like we have a simple higher low. So that's just once again taking place because we got the follow through very quickly from the reopening, and then we proceeded to hold a little better during that Europe session. So with that said, I know we took a couple extra moments there to look into these charts simply because we didn't have any major morning economic data points. And then on a day like today, it'll also be very interesting. We'll have our market profile displayed to take a look at as well in just about another 25 minutes. So that'll also set the stage for, some nice reference points for the day in front of us. And with that, we're going to dial it back here. I'm going to get a couple of my charts back up and adjusted and see what we have lining up for this early morning session in front of us here.